Our own Dino Seppi had an interesting take for the next five Grey Cups hosts and why. This is his opinion. Got a lot of traction, so here it goes. So, with the 109th Grey Cup that just happened in Saskatchewan, let's look at future host cities past 2024. So, the annual event will return to Hamilton, Ontario in 2023 for the 110th Grey Cup, followed by the most recent announcements of Vancouver, British Columbia, hosting the 111th edition of the yearly event in 2024. With that said, he gives us his take on who should host the next five Grey Cups and why. Look at a few factors for this one. Cities that have not held it in a while. We're assuming in 5 years the expansion in Atlantic Canada has come to fruition and a permanent stadium has been completed. Also, factors of accommodations along with food and beverage. Of course, all the main things that you need to have a good time for a Grey Cup. So, without further ado, here's Dino's next five Grey Cup locations and why. First up, Montreal, Quebec. Simply put, he's still not sure why it has not returned to Montreal, Quebec. They last hosted a Grey Cup in 2008. It was a great game that saw the Calgary Stampeders defeat the home hosts and the Montreal Alouettes 22-14. More importantly, a crowd of 66,308 attended the Grey Cup that day. So why should Montreal host a Grey Cup in 2025? There's a lot of variables that go with Montreal's way in this one. Hotels. Montreal has abundance of places for accommodation for any sort of large gathering. The downtown core, or La Centre-Ville de Montreal by the locals, has always been a hub of hotels. One of the most notable annual events is when Montreal hosts the Canadian Grand Prix during Formula One circuit. In 2022, a crowd of 338,000 attended the event during the weekend. On the low end, 180 to 200,000 is the norm during F1 weekend in Montreal. The city of Montreal has always accommodated large crowds for various events historically. Food. Is anyone a foodie? When Montreal is the place for you, whether it is fine dining or just local mom and pop shops in the city, it's safe to say that you will never have a bad meal in Montreal. Montrealers take pride in good food no matter what the budget is for the travel. You can take your pick on either Italian, Greek, Asian, French, African, or Caribbean cuisine, just to name a few. When it comes to diversity like Toronto, there's no food from around the world that you cannot have in Montreal. Social scene. Montreal has always been a hotbed for live music and great pubs. Their nightlife has always been well attended by both locals and travelers alike. Next up, Toronto, Ontario. He says he's going out on a limb on this one. You can say Toronto does not deserve it, as the locals in Toronto don't care about the CFL and the Grey Cup as a whole. Maybe they'll change their minds with winning the championship, but probably not. You're right and you're wrong. So why should Toronto host a Grey Cup in 2026? Well, the Argos were fully purchased by Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment in January of 2018. There is a lot of optimism in Toronto Argonauts' future as a relevant pro team in the Toronto sports landscape. However, it has been a roller coaster of success. At times, home attendance has been even lower than in previous seasons. But then you see a string of turnouts of 20,000 plus attend playoff games since 2017 when they would host a game. When the purchase was complete in 2018, one of the areas that MLSE wanted was to host 3 Grey Cups in about 10 years. The last Grey Cup being held in Toronto was 2016. Having one in 2026 would be their second in 10 years. Just like Montreal, Toronto is a carbon copy in a lot of ways, whether Torontonians or Montrealers would admit it to it. I'm not talking about Montreal architecture having a lot more of a historical appearance. What he's getting at is Toronto is very much a world-class city, as Montreal and Vancouver are to Canada. There's a lot of businesses around the world happening in Toronto on any given day. Food, take your pick. There is not a nation's flag not represented in Toronto. Toronto is one of the very few cities in the world where there are approximately 150 languages and dialects spoken in Toronto. Just like Montreal, there's a lot of high-end dining to your local dinner or for good food options from all over the world. Venues. Toronto has lots of venues to host the event. The Toronto Convention Center alone has hosted many international events and can host massive numbers. This has been the go-to spot during the past Grey Cup festivals when held in Toronto. Let's not forget hotels. Toronto has a lot of them, also like Montreal. with a few that are convention hotels. Hosting any large crowds would not be a problem in Toronto. In 2026, the World Cup of Soccer will be hosted by the United States of America, Canada, and Mexico. For the first time, it will be held 3 host nations for the World Cup. Toronto, along with Vancouver, is the lone Canadian cities that will host some of the matches. BMO Field will expand to 45,000 for the World Cup. With that said, it only makes sense to keep additional seating for a Grey Cup in November. Not a bad idea. This was done during the 2016 Grey Cup when it was also hosting the Toronto Maple Leafs versus Detroit Red Wings in the NHL outdoor game. Moreover, Toronto FC was in the MLS Cup final that year also and was the host. It all played out well in the end, where it was used by 3 different events. Winnipeg, Manitoba. Anytime the Grey Cup was held in Canadian prairies, there was a special aura about the event. This is why Winnipeg should host the Grey Cup in 2027. Unfortunately for Winnipeg, historically, they have not hosted a lot of Grey Cups. The last Grey Cup in Winnipeg was 2015. Before that, it was held back in 1991 and 1998 and 2006. All of those games were held at the defunct Winnipeg Stadium. So why should Winnipeg host the Grey Cup in 2027? The fans in Winnipeg love football. It's quite simple. Winnipeg, just like Saskatchewan, loves its football, just like all prairie-based teams in the CFL. Accommodations might not be as big city as of Montreal, Vancouver, or Toronto, but Winnipeg still has quite a few accommodation options and around the downtown core. The outdoors, there are a lot of festivals year-round in Winnipeg, and many are outdoors. There are a lot of green places in Winnipeg areas that outdoor people would enjoy. Diversity, over 100 languages are spoken in Winnipeg, which makes it good for food options and foodies alike. Winnipeg fans would love nothing more than the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to host and win a Grey Cup on their home soil. With the way GM Kyle Walters and head coach Mike O'Shea building this team in the last few years, it's safe to say they will still be a competitive team in the long haul. Finally, Halifax, Nova Scotia. He's going out on if all goes according to plan, and now the latest that the Atlantic Schooners have played their inaugural season by 2028. So why should Halifax host the Grey Cup in 2028 or 2029? The people, East Coasters in Canada are very humble people. They enjoy people's company. Hosting a Grey Cup festival will be a new for the city of Halifax, along with the province of Nova Scotia. The history. Halifax is a historical city in Canadian history. The Halifax Farmers Market was founded in 1750. You can visit the Halifax Citadel. In 1912, when the Titanic sunk, Halifax was one of the first to respond for relief aid. Halifax is no stranger to host big events. They hosted the Junior World Hockey Tournament in 2003, along with Sydney, Nova Scotia. In 2023, they will be co-hosting the games with Moncton and New Brunswick, the Halifax Donair. You just have to try one. If you're a footy, it's oh so good, according to him. I'll have to try one of that. It just needs to be gluten-free somehow. He says, I'd like Halifax to host back-to-back Grey Cups for the simple thing of revenue. This would give the Schooners much-needed monetary revenue, which will go to pay off the stadium sooner rather than later. That's a good point. I feel that Halifax, assuming it is up and running, should host 3 Grey Cups in 10 years for that sole purpose of this. Let's just say the pubs in downtown Halifax will be rocking during Grey Cup week. So what are your thoughts on the 5 cities and the time frame that they should host the next Grey Cup according to Dino Seppi? Let us know in the comments.